What if the school psychologist wasn't just helping you, but reporting on you? What if those gifted tests were really screenings for something darker? Between 1950 and 1973, the CIA ran covert behavioral experiments under projects like BLUEBIRD, ARTICHOKE, and MKUltra. They used hypnosis, electroshocks, trauma, and drugs, sometimes on minors and sometimes without consent. At the same time, programs like GATE emerged to identify gifted kids for national security pipelines. We can't say yet if these things are connected, but the timelines align and the methods look disturbingly familiar. What if these experiments weren't taking place in a lab, but in the classroom? Welcome back to Wicked Mysterious, or if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm your host, Danny, and I explore all kinds of mysteries from aliens to paranormal stories to unexplained phenomena. And today we're looking into one of the most unsettling segments of the GATE program. This is the third part into the deep dive that we're doing, so if you missed episodes 1 and 2, go back and listen to those first. Just a reminder that memberships are now open, and as a member, you get early access to episodes before the public, a private Discord channel with me and other members, and I will probably start doing members only live streams as well. So if you want to support this channel, check out the links below this video for PDF guides and merch. I made all of these products myself. I'm also opening up my conscious creation course soon, so sign up for the waiting list to work directly with me. With all that out of the way, let's get into it. I wanted to let you know that if the verbiage or word choice sounds a little off in this episode, it is intentional. I have to be really careful with what I say so that I don't get limited or demonetized. So please know that when I say vulnerable populations, I'm referring to individuals under the age of 18. This episode is very, very disturbing, and these topics were requested by listeners. I do think it's a very important piece to the puzzle, but please use discretion. So, just a quick recap. In 1958, the NDEA, or National Defense Education Act, was passed. This act was the first time the federal government got involved in education, and the goal was to provide a framework and funding to public schools and beyond, which included the hiring of school counselors. These counselors were trained in identifying gifted and talented students who were selected first for their high IQ. The federal government wanted to win the space race, but had no scientists or mathematicians to compete against the Soviet Union. The children selected for their high intelligence were sought out and quietly put into separate education programs known as GATE, TAG, or GT, with the end goal being a defense intelligence job in the United States government. This was without parental consent or knowledge. Sometime in the 1980s, they stopped looking at just IQ and had a whole slew of characteristics they were looking for to single out and separate children. By 2002, the SLDS was instated, which is a direct pipeline of your children's information, including attendance, behavioral reports, and standardized testing scores, straight to the federal government, and you're not allowed to opt out. Now, thousands of people are starting to recall very strange memories of their time in the GATE program, from having to drink strange substances to having to listen to hypnosis tapes that elicited out of body experiences to ESP testing. Even more strangely, some remember nothing at all. We have already cultivated quite the community of interesting and smart people here on YouTube. And if you would like to connect with others who went through similar things as you, check out my posts tab on this channel for a public Discord. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing Tavistock, Rickover, and the rise of state-controlled intelligence development. Or, put more simply, how the government took psychological warfare, weaponized it, and then quietly brought it into the school system. This is how the story of Cold War paranoia, CIA experimentation, and psychological science came together, and how somewhere in that mix, children became the test subjects. If you were ever labeled gifted, or if you were pulled out of class for strange testing, or if there are entire stretches of your childhood that you just can't remember, then this one's for you. So, let's start in London just after World War II. The Tavistock Clinic was founded during World War I by psychologist Hugh Crichton Miller. His goal was to offer clinical services both to adults and children, but the clinic really took off when they began helping World War I veterans with what was then called shell shock, now known as PTSD. It was a clinical setting, not experimental in the Black Ops sense, but its data and insights fed into military and government interest in behavioral prediction. At first glance, it sounds like a noble pursuit, helping men cope with the trauma of war. But the deeper you go, the more odd it becomes. They weren't just studying trauma, they were studying what trauma did to the mind, how it fragmented people, rewired their sense of identity, and made them programmable. During World War II, these same psychiatrists were recruited by the British Army to apply their work to officer selection and screening, studies in morale, propaganda design, and group cohesion under stress. By the time the war ended, they realized that what they had learned could be applied beyond the battlefield to peacetime society. They wanted to use what they had learned to rebuild the country's industry, education, and governance. Doing that with the structure of a medical clinic wasn't viable. They needed a new framework. So in 1947, they created the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. Under this new umbrella, they were able to go beyond medicine. The institute could explore social systems, businesses, governments, and mass behavior, not just mental health care. They were also now able to receive private and international funding. The institute was not under the British National Health Service like the original clinic was, meaning it could now accept money from other places. Unlike the clinic, which treated individuals, the institute could conduct consulting research and training for schools, corporations, and governments. This included things like education policy, recommending media communication strategies, and designing personnel systems for military and civil service. So next time your corporate office job gives you a pizza instead of a bonus, you can blame these guys. Two guys, Wilfred Bion and John Rees, started these theories on group behavior and compliance in the workplace. Bion developed the idea that groups act like individuals, that they have their own unconscious dynamics, defense mechanisms, and emotional currents. He noticed that people in groups unconsciously fall into roles like dependency on each other, rebellion, or scapegoating. This became the foundation for organizational psychology, crowd manipulation, and corporate consulting. Bion's work on how to steer group emotion without people realizing it is now standard in political messaging. It's also in media and even seen in classroom structure. John Rees, the other guy, was the founding director of the Tavistock Institute. He developed psychological profiling to be used during the selection of military officers. He advocated for invisible psychological guidance, where using psychology, they could softly influence and shape public behavior. He was even quoted as saying, "If we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarians and organize some kind of fifth column activity." So the fifth column he's referring to is a military term for internal sabotage. It refers to people inside a society working secretly to destabilize it from within, like spies and infiltrators, not your obvious enemies. Rees is saying that to control society effectively, you have to act like the regimes you claim to oppose, but very subtly and strategically and from the inside. Infiltrate professional and social activities means that the government wouldn't solely be responsible for control. It would come from within, people you trust in society to help you make decisions, like teachers, doctors, independent journalists, clergy, and even artists. These people influence us every day. This is a very eerie quote because it sounds like open advocacy for psychological manipulation of the general public, and that's essentially what they did. So, under the direction of these two dirtbags, Tavistock began asking questions like, how do you control a crowd? How do you seed an idea without making it obvious? What causes someone to dissociate, and how can that state be used? These weren't just abstract theories, they were testing them on soldiers and then later on citizens. After World War II, Tavistock's military expertise in group dynamics and morale manipulation caught the attention of the US government. Not good. With Rockefeller Foundation backing, Tavistock's methods were exported to America. So Who was John Rockefeller? I'm sure that you all hear this name quite often in conspiracy circles, and I knew a little bit about it, but I wasn't quite sure. So I did put this in here in case anybody wasn't familiar, like I wasn't. He is definitely tied to this bizarre puzzle. He was an American oil tycoon and the richest man in modern history. He founded Standard Oil, which became a near monopoly before it was broken up by the US government in 1911 under antitrust laws. After that, he shifted focus to philanthropy, founding the Rockefeller Foundation, the University of Chicago, and the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. Through the Flexner Report in 1910, funded by Rockefeller money, medical education in the US was standardized to focus on pharmaceutical treatments, essentially putting a stop to holistic medical treatments. This led to theories that the Rockefellers were the first to medicalize America for profit, since they did have ties to early pharmaceutical interests. They also funded population control initiatives. Now, again, I apologize in advance to everyone that already knows this information, but I did not know any of this. But of course, as a person educated solely by United States public school systems, I suppose this was purposely left out of our textbooks. And it actually goes quite deep and quite dark. The Population Council was founded in 1952 by John Rockefeller III. Its mission was to promote population stabilization, which is a PC term for population reduction in the developing world. It worked closely with Planned Parenthood and the World Health Organization, or WHO, and they helped push the widespread use of contraception, which on the face of it isn't necessarily a bad thing, as exponential population growth was expected and still is. They heavily supported the idea that overpopulation was the root cause of poverty, environmental collapse, and societal unrest. Their solution was controlled depopulation through medical interventions and fear mongering through the media by pushing a resource scarcity mindset, basically pushing the narrative that you may not be able to feed and clothe your family if you have too many children. But where it gets really disturbing is that the Rockefellers funded sterilization programs, particularly in India, Puerto Rico, and parts of Africa. The Rockefeller Foundation spent decades quietly funding the roots of India's population control system, establishing fertility research centers and sponsoring messaging campaigns that framed sterilization as a patriotic duty. But by the 1970s, population control wasn't just a public health goal, it was a condition for financial support. The World Bank, heavily influenced by U.S. foreign policy interest, tied major development loans to population reduction targets. In 1975 alone, it granted $66 million to India's sterilization programs, while U.S. aid offered tens of millions more with strings attached. India was under intense pressure to act and act fast. That same year, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi declared the emergency. This was a 21-month period of suspended civil liberties and unchecked authoritarian rule. Her son, Sanjay Gandhi, led a brutal campaign that sterilized over 6 million people in 1 year. They used coercion, deception, and even force. Rural men were rounded up and operated on in camps with barely any anesthesia. Poor families were told they'd lose their food rations, their land, or even their jobs if they didn't comply. The Rockefeller Foundation didn't run the emergency, but the programs they helped fund were the ones to carry it out. And while there's no public record linking them directly to the World Bank, the Rockefellers' family influence was deeply embedded in post war institutions, including the founding of both the United Nations and the World Bank itself. When the emergency ended in 1977, the damage was irreversible. Millions of people were left traumatized and left with no trust in their government, and not a single group was held accountable for this. These organizations that called themselves philanthropic were quietly supporting programs that violated human rights on a mass scale. And it wasn't just in India either. Versions of this same thing, funded by the same groups, happened in Puerto Rico, where over one-third of women were sterilized by 1968. Also, this happened in Peru in the 1990s and parts of Africa and Southeast Asia through secret contraception trials. All of this obviously fuels claims that the family had a hand in mind control, social engineering, and population management. They're often accused of promoting a secret agenda, what some call the New World Order. And this is a rabbit hole in itself, and we could continue down it for a very long time. But I want to back up to the Tavistock Institute. With Rockefeller funding, they helped shape the birth of major Cold War era think tanks. The first one we'll cover is called the RAND Corporation, which stands for Research and Development. This was founded in 1948 to study military strategy, but quickly expanded into behavioral science and psychological operations. They also used predictive modeling. These researchers used the same style systems that Tavistock had used, and they wanted to forecast how populations might react under nuclear threat or how people reacted to propaganda or economic stress. And Rand tested decision making under pressure, which was also something Tavistock was interested in. And then there was the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI. We have discussed SRI pretty heavily in different episodes on this channel in relation to different psi research, but they were also influenced by Tavistock's groupthink and perception studies. They went on to manage Project Stargate and consciousness manipulation in the 1970s. Some of SRI's ideas were very similar to Tavistock's work on suggestibility and emotional priming. Then came the MITRE Corporation, or Massachusetts Institute of Technology Research Establishment. That is a mouthful. And they are a very interesting organization. They operate as a private nonprofit and work exclusively for the US government. They work across all agencies pretty much: the CIA, NSA, FBI, NIH, and Department of Defense. And they're involved in artificial intelligence and predictive modeling like the rest. And they're also interested in behavioral science and influence operations. They handle cybersecurity and threat detection, healthcare data systems, and domestic surveillance programs. They're often described as the invisible contractor because they design the systems that the government uses for pretty much everything, from air traffic control to military logistics to even behavioral surveillance tools. And all of these early groups and programs set the stage for what happened next. In 1950, under the direction of CIA Director Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the agency launched Project BLUEBIRD. Its mission was to develop methods to extract information without consent and also to create amnesia on command. They wanted to learn how to control someone's behavior through hypnosis, drugs, or trauma. And the early experiments target vulnerable people, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and people in institutions. There is speculation and some indirect evidence that these experiments occurred in children's hospitals and in juvenile detention centers, though many of these records are conveniently missing or were conveniently destroyed. And one memo, now declassified, discusses whether agents could induce total loss of memory and then implant new identities through hypnosis alone. And unfortunately for us, they found that yes, they could. And then that opened the door for something even worse. Project Artichoke was similar to BLUEBIRD, but it took it a step further. Running from 1951 to 1953, Artichoke asked the question nobody wanted answered. Can we make someone do something against their will, even something deadly, without them remembering it? They tested some pretty extreme scenarios like drug induced compliance, hypnotic triggers, and psychological breaking points. They explored forced drug addiction and withdrawal to control test subjects. They even administered LSD and mescaline. Some patients were subjected to electroshock in combination with those drugs. Again, evidence points to tests conducted in institutional settings, including hospitals and mental wards, not necessarily schools, but the names of child facilities are redacted. But there are some interesting patterns, especially in rural facilities like Catholic run orphanages and closed door psychiatric wards. These subjects were chosen because they were accessible and isolated, and, in the words of one Artichoke memo, not strategically visible. And of course, that's code for nobody would know and no one would ask questions. In 1953, the CIA consolidated its programs into one umbrella operation, MKUltra. Run by Sidney Gottlieb, known as the Black Sorcerer, MKUltra included over 149 known subprojects and untold more that have never been disclosed. Their goal was to find a way to control the human mind. MKUltra involved a lot of really horrific things like unwitting LSD dosing, including on minors, sleep deprivation, isolation tanks, and hypnosis and voice loop programming. They also used electroshock therapy, and there was even documented abuse in Subproject 68, which I will circle back to in a moment. Other disturbing examples include Dr. Loretta Bender's child shock therapy, which occurred at Bellevue Hospital in New York City, experimenting on kids diagnosed with what she called autistic schizophrenia. There's an alleged program called Project Monarch, and this supposedly was trauma based programming on minors for Black Ops, exploitation, and certain intelligence roles. It is important to note that these specific reports came from whistleblower accounts only, so there's not been substantiated proof of this, but patterns and timelines do match up, leading many to believe that this likely did happen. Many survivors report memory loss, fragmented or multiple identities, recurring nightmares, often of labs or cold metal tables, and skills they don't remember learning, like languages, code, or familiarity of certain geographical areas. So, back to that subproject 68. Again, this is a whole rabbit hole in itself, but I'll briefly cover it here because I found it horrific, but also interesting. In the 1950s, while MKUltra was starting up in the US, another branch was starting in Montreal, Canada. It was called Subproject 68, and it was led by Dr. Ewan Cameron, one of the most respected psychiatrists of his time. Well, until this. He ran the Allen Memorial Institute at McGill University, and his patients came to him for help with anxiety, depression, and postpartum issues. What they got instead was state funded psychological torment. CIA money was funneled through a group that was used as a front, and it was innocently named the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. And Dr. Cameron conducted experiments designed to erase and reprogram the human mind by creating a total blank slate and then rebuilding it. Patients were subjected to a lot of the same things as the other projects under MKUltra, such as extremely high dose electroshocks, 30 to 40 times the standard therapeutic level, drug-induced comas lasting up to 65 consecutive days, and LSD and barbiturates, all while unconscious, and something called psychic driving, and this was looped messages that played for hours or days while patients were sedated or restrained. And after being let out, many of these victims were left unable to speak, walk, or even recognize their families. Some never recovered at all. And while the official records don't admit to it, of course they wouldn't, multiple survivor testimonies point to something else. There are many accounts from victims waking up disoriented, being touched or violated, and invasive procedures with no explanation. Women in their most vulnerable state, drugged, restrained, reported fragmented memories that suggest really inappropriate treatments that have been part of the process, or at the very least occurred while these programs were happening. So, why in Canada? Well, the CIA funded it there because it was outside of US jurisdiction. There could be no American lawsuits, there was no accountability, and Dr. Cameron, a trusted academic, gave the operation the appearance that it was legitimate. I wanted to briefly explain that LSD and other psychedelics, when used with intention, can help with deep personal insight. Safe usage of LSD has helped people confront trauma and suppressed emotions. And in a spiritual sense, it aids the feeling of unity, it dissolves ego, and helps people transcend. Johns Hopkins has actually done clinical trials and even proved that those who experimented with hallucinogens had a belief changing experience, typically a new belief in a higher consciousness or a oneness of all things. These changes in belief and perception were long lasting and widespread across users. But because of the suggestible state that users can enter, intent and environment is everything. So, unwitting minors and other vulnerable populations were not having spiritual awakenings after being given LSD. They were being experimented on and having their consciousness shattered in their most vulnerable state. And then in 1969, Vice Admiral Rickover, sometimes called the father of nuclear navy, gave an interview to the Washington Post. In it, he made a now famous statement, which was, quote, "The gifted child is a national resource." Think about that phrasing. A resource, like a child, is oil or a weapon that they could tap into and exploit. Rickover believed that the United States was falling behind in science, defense, and innovation, and his answer was to track the brightest children early and train them relentlessly to serve national security goals. This idea lit a fire. It helped shape the National Defense Education Act, particularly Title V, which allocated massive funding to schools to identify, test, and track high performing kids. And this was discussed in detail in episode 2. But this wasn't just about having a high IQ or scoring well on standardized tests. The CIA took notice, and they weren't just trying to set education policy, but they wanted to observe the whole thing to see who was being flagged. They were very interested in who might be useful or who might be vulnerable. So, if you thought things couldn't get darker than psychological testing on orphans or postpartum mothers without consent, let me introduce to you Michael Aquino. He was a high ranking U.S. Army officer in psychological operations and also a practicing occultist. He founded the Temple of Set after breaking away from Anton LaVey's Church of Satan in the 1970s. You might remember Anton LaVey from a recent episode I did on celebrity conspiracies. LaVey was the father of the satanic priestess Zena Shrek, who looks just like Taylor Swift. But anyway, back to Aquino. He co-authored a paper in 1980 with Colonel Paul Valley, and that was called From PSYOP to Mind War, The Psychology of Victory. Aquino was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army and served in psychological operations, or PSYOP, within the 1st Special Forces Command, Airborne and Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations and Command, and he argued that future wars could be fought through belief systems and the mind. The goal wasn't just to defeat an enemy, it was to make them believe they'd already lost. It was to shape perception itself so completely that people wouldn't even know they were in a war. He wasn't just talking about propaganda. He talked about using symbols, rituals, suggestions, mass media, and even electromagnetic fields to induce emotional compliance. He said, quote, "Mind war is not new. It's the strategy that was used effectively by the conquerors of the past. It is the deliberate, aggressive convincing of all participants that the war is already lost or already won," end quote. This reflects everything Tavistock was doing with groupthink, everything MKUltra was doing with trauma and identity disruption, but now without the drugs. Aquino's weapon of choice wasn't LSD. It was the pushed narrative. It was ritual and atmosphere, even frequencies and emotion. And while all of this was happening, he was stationed at places like Fort Bragg and the Presidio Army Base, where incidentally he was later accused of being involved in abuse scandals during the 1980s. Those charges were dropped and he did deny everything, but the allegations and the timeline, as well as his access to military and psychological facilities, made this very believable and really scary. And to this day, his name is a symbol of weaponized belief. So, once again, this sent me down a whole new rabbit hole. So, just to touch briefly on what happened at this daycare with Aquino, the Presidio Army Base had an on base daycare, and multiple children alleged that they had been taken out of the preschool to off site houses and shown strange rituals. They recalled seeing people in robes, candles. They said they saw blood and recall hearing chanting. These children shared memories of inappropriate treatment, sometimes in groups, and Aquino and his wife Lilith, who was also a Temple of Set member, were accused by name at least by one child. Aquino and his wife did actually live on base right near the daycare. So then this led me to the McMartin preschool case. From 1983 to 1990, the McMartin Preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, was investigated for ritualistic acts on children who were under the age of 6. The children recalled being taken through secret tunnels beneath the school, watching animal sacrifices, seeing cloaked figures and flying witches, hearing chanting and being threatened if they ever told anyone, and being flushed down toilets and ending up in what they called magic rooms. Interestingly, in 1993, an excavation was done and it did confirm that there was disturbed earth consistent with tunnels beneath the school. There was also evidence of filled in passages. There were unusual features in the building, like air vents and access points leading away from bathroom areas. During this investigation, 7 people were arrested, but the jury was hung and the case was eventually dismissed. And right around the time Aquino was writing Mind War, another program was taking shape. One that didn't target a test subject or a soldier in a lab, it targeted all of us. This wasn't just war for the mind anymore. This was Project Chaos. So while MKUltra broke people's minds, Project Chaos kept lists. From 1967 to 1974, Project Chaos was the CIA's domestic surveillance program. Very illegal, but very real. They tracked anti war students, Black Panthers, civil rights leaders, and peace activists, also journalists and musicians like John Lennon, who was followed for years by this program. Chaos wasn't about experimenting, it was about identifying who could disrupt the narrative. So, this kind of leads me to believe that this had something to do with Gate, but I can't quite tie those threads together just yet. They used disinformation, psychological harassment, and they planted evidence. So, what does this have to do with education? Well, pretty much everything. Because if Chaos was just tracking these people, they were watching minds flagged as too creative, too sensitive, too questioning, and that does kind of sound familiar. So, let's put it all together. Tavistock created the psychological tools. BLUEBIRD and ARTICHOKE tested them in secrecy. MKUltra then scaled it up. Chaos tracked who thought differently. And then Rickover told the government to mine the smartest kids like a natural resource. So suddenly you've got this framework where children are both the target and the test subject. Was the GATE program just gifted education? Maybe, it could be for some, but for others, it could have been the recruitment list or the control group. What we don't have yet is the smoking gun that definitively ties GATE to other CIA programs, but that's not really surprising. The CIA destroyed most of the MKUltra files in 1973, and the rest is heavily redacted. Plus, education programs wouldn't necessarily be classified under CIA. They might be filtered through the DoD, the Department of Education, or private research foundations like RAND or the Human Ecology Fund. The overlap in language and methods is hard to ignore. GATE had a focus on gifted and exceptional children, while MKUltra focused on non-conforming and high potential, or even suggestible individuals. GATE performed psychological testing in schools, while MKUltra performed psychological and behavioral testing in institutions. GATE categorized, tracked, and clustered children, while MKUltra was identifying and isolating subjects for longitudinal study. And GATE had an emphasis on creativity, abstraction, and pattern recognition, while MKUltra targeted dissociative traits and altered perception. Multiple whistleblowers and GATE alumni report eerily similar experiences, from memory gaps to sensitivity to sound or light and certain triggers, feeling like they're being watched, tracked, or tested as children and beyond, and interactions with school psychologists or unusual testing methods. Some people recall participation in weird classroom experiments, such as that Heads Up 7-Up style psychic guessing game. So, what are we really looking at here? A government experiment? A misused education system? Or just a strange, unfortunate overlap of Cold War paranoia, psychological theory, and public policy? Probably not. The truth is, though, it may be all three. What we do know is that the same tools used in classified experiments to study the mind, hypnosis, sensory influence, identity tracking, all showed up later in classrooms. And the people most likely to remember it are the ones who were told they were gifted. Whether this was about shaping future intelligence workers or simply observing how minds develop under pressure, the gaps in memory, the questions, or the strange memories all still remain. And the more we dig, the more the timelines align. So, in future episodes, we are going to be interviewing some people that believe that they were part of this program and some of the memories that they recall. But for now, I hope you did enjoy this episode. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe. Comment down below with your thoughts. And don't forget that memberships are now open. And check out the links below for merch. I will see you again in a few weeks. Stay mysterious.